Today, we're continuing to explore the history of the Douglas Aircraft Company. This is part 3 of our video series, so if you haven't watched parts 1 and 2 yet, I highly recommend doing so. Last time, we looked at the company's history from 1929 until the end of the Second World War. It was a period that saw Douglas dominate the commercial airline market with the DC-3, and then saw it expand to produce a truly staggering amount of aircraft during the Second World War. Today, we're looking at the final decades of the company, those that take it from 1945 until its merger with McDonnell in 1967, which gave birth to the McDonnell-Douglas Corporation. Like with Part 2, a lot of aircraft were produced during this time period, so we will discuss the aircraft in general, rather than going into specific details, as this video is on the history of the company as a whole, and later on individual aircraft will get their own in-depth video. So, we begin today with the end of the Second World War, following the surrender of Imperial Japan. On VJ Day itself, Douglas received a telegram. It told him that the government was immediately cancelling most of its existing orders. Orders that had been so great in size that they had necessitated the operation of no less than 6 manufacturing plants. Douglas had known that this day was coming, and he had been preparing for it for some time, but even so, the end of the war came far earlier than he had expected, and he was faced with the sudden challenge of shrinking his company in rapid time. The result was that within just a few short weeks, the leasing of the plants in Chicago, Oklahoma City, and Tulsa was stopped, with the government stepping in to acquire the facilities as originally planned, and over 90,000 people were laid off from the Douglas workforce. Though it had also been built under the Wartime Emergency Plant Facilities Program, the Long Beach plant wasn't given over to government control. Not all existing orders had been cancelled, and enough C-74s were on order to justify Douglas purchasing the majority of this plant in November of 1946. Though Long Beach and the other facilities had produced an astonishing amount of aircraft during the war, the Douglas Aircraft Company itself had not massively grown from the standpoint of finance. Combined profits from the war years amounted to just 1.5%, and this left Douglas with fewer reserves of cash than he could have wished for the lean post-war years that were now his company's new reality. The history of Douglas's immediate post-war years, which take things to the outbreak of the Korean War, are in some ways a mirror image of the later interwar years. Whereas before, Douglas relied on orders for tried and tested commercial designs, whilst experimenting with various military projects, it now relied on tried and tested military designs and had to get inventive when it came to airliners. Of the military designs, the ones that were still on order in quantity were the C-54 Skymaster and the AD-1 Sky Raider. Though, I say in quantity, it didn't really amount to much. For comparison's sake, the company had produced over 11,500 aircraft in 1944, but in 1946 it built just 127. Small wonder they had to lay off over 100,000 people. But although only a handful were produced in 1946, the new Sky Raider was an aircraft that held much promise. The origins of the Sky Raider came from a wartime need to replace the Douglas SPD Dauntless, which, whilst an excellent aircraft in its own right, was still a pre-war design. Douglas had initially lost out on a chance to produce a replacement, as Curtiss Wright had won a contract for the SB-2C Helldiver, but, as some people will know from the video where we covered the interesting history of that particular aircraft, things did not go too smoothly, and the Navy sought out alternatives in case a replacement was rapidly needed. Now, this initially resulted in the abortive Destroyer, which will get its own video in the future, but following meetings between Douglas engineer Ed Heinemann and Rear Admiral Lawrence Richardson, the company was given yet another reprieve to submit a new design in the summer of 1944. This reprieve did come with something of a caveat. Heinemann could submit a new design to the Navy, certainly, but it had to A. Make use of the powerful Wright R3350 duplex Cyclone, a twin-row supercharged 18-cylinder radial, and B. Heinemann had to submit this new design proposal by 9 AM the following day. After working until 3 AM, when exhaustion forced them to quit, Heinemann's design team had put together just enough for a reasonable design proposal, and the next day it was submitted to the Navy and was subsequently approved. With the SPD Dauntless out of production, this reprieve was a lifeline for Heinemann and the El Segundo Division, who, at the time, were in danger of having 0 naval contracts by the end of 1945. Because of this, every conceivable effort was put into making this new design superior to the competition. This competition included the Kaiser Fleetwing XTBK and the Martin XBTM. Both of these aircraft were highly advanced and featured very high payload capabilities. Heinemann realized that to be successful, their design not only had to be able to carry more, but it also had to be lighter, better performing, and, most importantly, in the emerging world of highly complex power plants, it had to be as simple and as reliable as possible to maintain. This design philosophy would eventually pay dividends, because over 3,000 Douglas AD-1s would eventually be produced, against just 151 Martin AM Maulers, and just 5 of the Kaiser Fleetwing prototypes. The Sky Raider proved to be exceedingly reliable and capable, and because of this it remained in service far into the jet age, not being retired from service in the US until the mid-1970s. The success of the AD-1 was one of Douglas's biggest financial assets in the sparse years that spanned 1946 to 1950, and it helped to particularly offset some dramatic investments that the company was beginning to make in the commercial market. In this market, Douglas faced 2 major sources of competition. The first was, ironically, its own success. Following the war, large numbers of C-47s and C-54s, the military variants of the DC-3 and DC-4, went up for sale as surplus. Naturally, a large number of these were acquired by various airlines around the world, who promptly converted them back to their commercial specifications. Now, whilst this did provide Douglas with some security, as they could at least manage the provision of spare parts, it did provide them with a challenge for developing a brand new airliner. They had to A, produce something significantly better than their existing designs, but B, produce it at a competitive price point that skirted very close to the line that separated profit from loss. This challenge was further exacerbated by the other major source of competition, and that was designs being built by Lockheed and Boeing. In 1943, the prototype Lockheed XC-69 had made its first flight, and now in the post-war years it was being adapted for commercial use as the L-049 Constellation. Similarly, Boeing was working on their Model 377 Stratocruiser, which was a commercial variant of the C-97 Stratofreighter, which itself was a transport version of the B-29 Superfortress. Both of these designs represented a significant commercial threat. Not only were they both equipped with pressurized cabins, which the Douglas's flagship DC-4 lacked, but they also had significantly faster cruising speeds, and they could carry at least 30% more passengers and cargo over longer distances. Douglas's attempt at matching the competition of numerous and cheaper surplus aircraft was to modernize and improve the existing design of the DC-3. Meanwhile, the company would address the threats from Lockheed and Boeing by converting an abandoned wartime army transport, the Douglas XC-112. At the time, it was said by some that the only replacement for the DC-3 would be another DC-3. This was an opinion held by several airliners, and to a degree by Donald Douglas himself. However, the airlines that wanted an improved version of the DC-3 were ones that were more focused on short and medium-distance flights, and Douglas's own opinion reflected his financially conservative mindset. Douglas was not one to often take financial gambles, and he believed that the demand for twin-engine airliners like the DC-3 would still outpace that for the larger, faster, and more expensive four-engine designs that had gradually emerged. The result was the development of the DC-3 Super, or DC-3S for short. It was to be faster and more capable than the original DC-3, while at the same time maintaining the same levels of comfort, safety, and efficiency. To achieve this, numerous modifications had to be made. The aircraft had a lengthened fuselage, bringing the passenger capacity up to 30. The engines were upgraded to the Pratt & Whitney R2000s, which were used on the DC-4, the fuselage was strengthened, and, to account for the shift in the centre of gravity and improve performance, the wingspan was slightly shortened, and the outer sections of the wings now had a sweep back of 4 degrees and squared-off wingtips. Though the DC-3S did indeed provide a marked increase in performance and capability over the original DC-3, it was not a competitive success. The design team had underestimated the amount of modifications that would be required to achieve the new performance figures airlines wanted, and the result was that the DC-3S only shared about 25% common parts with the original DC-3, and this of course made it too expensive. In the end, most major airliners either continued to use existing DC-3s, or they upgraded to newer, bigger, faster designs that were being offered at a more competitive price point. The DC-3 Super wasn't a complete loss though, for once again the US Navy had come in to save the day. Around 100 aircraft were eventually ordered as the R-4D, which came in several different variants. Some of these were used as staff or VIP transports, some were specifically modified as cold weather transports, several were used as training aircraft, and a few were modified to carry radar countermeasure equipment. Now, while Douglas struggled with the DC-3 Super, it fared much better in its head-on competition against Lockheed and Boeing. Here, the playing field was fairly even. Each company was trying to repurpose an existing World War II design for the post-war commercial market, and in this particular battle, Douglas would come out on top with the DC-6. Its origins went back to the DC-4. Even before the prototype had flown, Donald Douglas, Ed Heinemann, and Arthur Raymond had been contemplating the idea of fitting a passenger transport with a pressurized cabin. But at the time, the cost of doing so was prohibitively expensive, and a large amount of research and development would have to be invested. The company was doing well with DC-3 sales and pre-sales of the DC-4, but it couldn't justify that level of expense. Then, the huge demands of the Second World War put paid to any further considerations for commercial transports, and they got to work designing military transports instead. But they didn't abandon the idea of using a pressurized cabin, and when the Army funded a program to improve the C-54 Skymaster, the militarized DC-4, the Douglas team submitted a proposal for a pressurized prototype known as the C-54E. Ordered as the XC-112, it was longer and had more powerful engines than the standard C-54, and it featured other systems that were required for operations at high altitudes, such as a more powerful de-icing system for the wing leading edge. In general, the aircraft was a big improvement over the old C-54, but the war was over before the type had a chance to go into production. By this point, Douglas was aware of the developments over at Lockheed and at Boeing, and, seeing the promise held by their new pressurized transports, he organized for the XC-112 to be modified into the company's first pressurized airliner. Redesignated as the DC-6, it made its first flight in its commercial configuration on the 29th of June 1946. Even before its first flight, Douglas had received interest from both United Airlines and American, who were both equally concerned as their main rival, TWA, had secured priority orders for the competing Lockheed Constellation. Despite the sharp increases in development and production costs, when compared to the unpressurized airliners of the interwar period, Douglas was surprised to find that they had over 100 DC-6s on order by the end of 1946 alone. The type entered service simultaneously with United and American in November of that same year, and Douglas was soon flying out to the head office of Pan American to personally close the sale of even more. Boasting huge performance and comfort improvements over the DC-4, and with the aid of a strengthening world economy, the DC-6 became an instant success. Though the Lockheed Constellation was the first to enter service, Douglas's DC-6 quickly overtook the domestic market for sales by the end of 1946, though the type didn't enter service until the following April, and interest was rapidly growing overseas as well. This lead in sales was then quickly reversed in the opening months of 1947, then bounced back to Douglas by the summer, then bounced back to Lockheed by the autumn, and the two companies found themselves locked in the biggest commercial battle in the age of the piston-powered airliner. Now, Boeing, on the other hand, had missed the mark with its Stratocruiser, whose operating costs had put it far behind. On average, it was just over twice as expensive to operate when compared to the DC-6. It was troubled by reliability issues, which exploded its maintenance costs, and in the end only 56 would be delivered as commercial airliners. Although the DC-6 was off to an excellent start, the whole program was almost brought down in October of 1947. That month, a United Airlines DC-6 had suddenly caught fire above Bryce Canyon in Utah, and it had gone down, killing all 52 people on board. A thorough examination of the Utah crash had revealed that the fire had started somewhere in the lower fuselage, but its true cause was unknown. At first, it was thought that it may have been due to something volatile being stowed in a passenger's luggage, but then, less than a month later, another DC-6 was almost brought down by fire as well, but this one was able to make an emergency landing in New Mexico before the fire reached a critical point. Following this incident, Douglas immediately grounded the entire DC-6 fleet, and he sent Arthur Raymond and a team out to New Mexico to aid in the investigation. They soon found that the fire had been caused by an unexpected design flaw. The team discovered that a fuel tank transfer switch had been left on during the flight. Although this was not recommended procedure, it was also not strictly barred by any formal directive. Now, if the switch was left on, and if one of the tanks were overfilled during ground refueling, it could cause excess fuel to overflow through a vent. At certain altitudes and air pressures, this was even more likely, and if the fuel did overflow, it trickled down to a point in the wing where it was sucked into an intake for the cabin heating system, which of course would then cause the fuel to ignite. The solution to the problem was, in the end, quite simple. The fuel vents were moved further out to the outer tips of the wings, which solved the issue. But the tragic affair had deeply disturbed both Douglas and Raymond. Douglas demanded a thorough overview of the entire design of the DC-6, and if anything was found to pose even a remote fire risk, it had to be changed. This resulted in many small changes that cumulatively made the aircraft much safer. After this, the only DC-6s that were ever lost to fire were the result of either poor aircraft maintenance or other external factors, rather than something wrong with the design itself. Production of the DC-6 ended in 1958, by which point the Douglas Aircraft Company had produced over 700 models over several different commercial and military variants. Once again, the demand for the type had far exceeded Douglas's modest expectations, much like with the DC-3, and the company had well and truly emerged as the winner between Boeing, Douglas, and Lockheed in the battle of the piston airliners. However, the success of the DC-6 was, ironically, one of the many things that would lead to the company's eventual downfall. It reinforced Douglas's conservative mindset that modernizing and improving existing designs often provided far better returns than designing a new, innovative, and expensive commercial aircraft from the ground up. And this would be a large contributing factor in the company's somewhat delayed entry into the jet age, at least when it came to airliners. Now, when it came to experimental and cutting-edge military aircraft, Douglas was far more enthusiastic. Though the late 40s were lean years, as far as military contracts went, there was still enough work going around to keep things ticking over, particularly for the El Segundo division. This was a period of rapid technological transition, and this was reflected by the various military and experimental aircraft that were developed there between 1945 and 1950. The experimental XB-43, which was a redesigned version of the XB-42, first flew in May 1946, and it was the first jet-powered bomber to fly in the United States. It would not go into production, but it did aid in the company's development of laminar flow wings, the development of new avionics systems, and it exposed Douglas engineers to the benefits, and the various drawbacks, of the new turbojet engine. These lessons were immediately applied to the Douglas 558 Skystreak, which was a collaborative project between Douglas, the US Navy, and NACA, or NACA, whichever you prefer to call it. Originally proposed as a three-phase project, the Skystreak was a stubby, jet-powered aircraft designed to explore the relatively unknown and relatively dangerous phenomena found at transonic speeds. Following this, it was then to be developed into 6 individual and far more powerful designs that were to explore the supersonic speed range. However, these later plans were dropped, and the Skystreak was instead developed into the Skyrocket. It was designed to use a reaction motor's rocket engine in conjunction with a Westinghouse J3440. Both of these projects were headed by Ed Heinemann. The Skystreak pioneered many innovations, with its airframe being designed to withstand loads up to 18 G, and being equipped with sophisticated cooling systems that mitigated the effects of thermal heating on the cockpit. Though it provided valuable research data about aircraft and airfoil performance at the transonic speed range, its performance was overshadowed by the Bell X-1, which broke the sound barrier in 1947. The Skyrocket, on the other hand, would receive the publicity that the Skystreak was denied, becoming the first aircraft to exceed Mach 2 in November of 1943. Donald Douglas considered the project one of his company's proudest achievements, and Ed Heinemann's team freely shared their data with the aircraft industry to both further advance the development of research aircraft and, in the wake of the tragic loss of the Bell X-2, to improve the general standards of safety for all experimental research aircraft moving forward. The Skyrocket also saw some key involvement from Donald Douglas Jr., who had been rising through the company ranks and was now head of flight test operations. The development of the Skyrocket, and that of several other projects, highlighted the younger Douglas's keen interest in the cutting-edge aerospace developments being made, and he would play a major role in spurring the development of some of the company's most advanced projects in the 1950s and 1960s. At the same time that development of the experimental Skystreak had begun, the El Segundo division had also begun work on the company's first mass-produced jet aircraft. In 1946, Douglas was awarded a contract to build the XF-3D-1, and like many before, this was a contract issued by the US Navy. Its Bureau of Aeronautics wanted a twin-engined, carrier-based night fighter, and one that came equipped with an airborne radar that could detect the enemy at a range of 125 miles, whilst flying at 40,000 feet at an average speed of 500 miles an hour. Owing to these very lofty requirements, what would become known as the F-3D Skynight had a very troubled early development. Early airborne radar was very bulky, and it necessitated compromises when it came to the size and shape of the airframe, something which resulted in much bickering between Ed Heinemann and various representatives from the Bureau. This bickering then turned into considerably heated arguments when the J-34 engines underperformed, and on numerous occasions Heinemann had to repeatedly explain that the prototype's lackluster performance was a result of the engines being bad, rather than the aircraft producing too much drag. Eventually, the problems were mostly overcome when the F-3D-2 entered into production. With improved engine performance and the latest onboard systems, some of which were a little smaller than those on the prototype, the Skynight was one of the best military aircraft in the world in 1951. During the Korean War, it would down more enemy aircraft than any other in the US Navy, and it became the first fighter to secure a kill at night using a radar without any visual identification of the target. The F-3D, and the Douglas Company at large, was also a key player in the development of what would become the AIM-7 Sparrow. Starting with projects in the Second World War, Douglas had begun to expand into the development of both guided and unguided missiles, as well as more powerful designs that were intended to explore outer space. Now, the development of these various systems is technically beyond the scope of today's video, as we're mostly focusing on aircraft, but I will give a brief account of the major involvement of Douglas when it came to this sort of technology, as it did form a not insignificant chunk of the company's revenue during the 1950s and 60s. So, in no particular order, I'll cover it briefly. The company was part of the collaborative effort to develop the Nike Ajax surface-to-air missile, being responsible for the aerodynamic studies and the design of its airframe. It played a key role in the development and production of the early iterations of the Sparrow air-to-air missile, as mentioned before, and it also explored the development of active radar homing systems. In the field of space rocketry in particular, Douglas designed and manufactured the second stage of the bumper sounding rockets, which were very heavily modified versions of the V-2. But the company's biggest claim to fame was its work on the larger launch vehicles of the 50s and 60s. Douglas developed and produced the PGM-17 Thor, which was the United States' first operational ballistic missile. Though it was quickly eclipsed as a weapon of war with the emergence of the ICBM, the Thor became the foundation of the family Delta of rockets, with NASA and Douglas signing a production contract in 1959. Though the military models were dogged by guidance problems, which led to some spectacular explosions, those used by NASA, who allowed more freedom for modifications, achieved an outstanding level of reliability. In 1966, Douglas was proud to report that of the 189 Thor launches, all but 9 had been successful. By this point, Douglas had also produced the S-4B, which was the third stage of the Saturn V rocket used in the Apollo moon program. It also formed the foundation for Skylab, which was the only space station built and exclusively operated by the United States. But along with producing various missiles and launch systems, Douglas also got involved with the development of bombs, underwing pylon systems, avionics, and ejection seats. The company went through a period of huge diversification between 1948 and 1966, one that started from a need to keep the company afloat in a time of reduced sales, and that ended with it having far more projects than it could manage, and, when coupled with the high cost of its airline projects, would have disastrous results. But putting that aside for the time being, we'll take a look at the rest of the company's history first, before we get to the chaos that unfolded in 1966. By 1950, military contracts once again formed the bulk of the company's business, accounting for approximately 87% of all sales. Though the DC-6 had proven to be popular, it had not been enough to offset the combination of a post-war slump, reduced military demand, and ever-increasing development costs. 1947 had been a particularly bleak year when the company posted its first ever loss of $2.1 million, and its workforce had shrunk to approximately 1/7 of its World War II peak. By the time the Korean War broke out, the company was back in the black though, and a big part of this was thanks to the C-124 Globemaster. Though it looked like it had been stung on the nose by a bee, this large cargo hauler and troop transport soon became the standard airplane of its type to operate with the US Air Force. The combined effects of the Korean War and the development of the Cold War in general soon led to a rapid increase in military aircraft production. Existing World War II designs, which had been sent off to Korea in a panicked hurry, were soon joined by Douglas AD Skyraiders, F-3D Skyknights, C-118s, the militarized version of the DC-6, and the aforementioned C-124. Additionally, work was well underway on the development of the A-3D Skywarrior, which was a jet-powered strategic bomber, and work was also underway on the F-4D Skyray, which would become the first US Navy aircraft that could achieve Mach 1 in level flight. Though it would never see combat, arriving too late for the Korean War, the Skyray was a deeply striking design, and one of my personal favourites from the early Cold War period, so definitely expect to see an in-depth video on that particular aircraft in the future. The sudden influx of production orders meant that by the mid-1950s, the Douglas facilities were once again operating near their maximum capacity. Santa Monica continued production of the DC-6 and began mass production of the military transports. Long Beach worked on the C-124 and the Douglas B-66. And El Segundo went back to its old trick of producing naval aircraft in frightening numbers, being responsible for the production of the F-3D and F-4D fighters, as well as the AD-1, soon to be renamed as the A-1, the A3D, and it was also tooling up for the production of the A4 Skyhawk. The A1 Skyraider and the A4 Skyhawk were by far and away El Segundo's biggest success stories. Douglas would produce just under 3,200 A1s, with the type forming a significant chunk of its entire post-war production, and just under 3,000 A4 Skyhawks would be built under both the Douglas name and then later on as McDonnell Douglas after 1967. The years immediately following the Korean War were ones that once again saw the Douglas Company experience healthy financial growth. Net income grew to $18 million in 1953, and then doubled again to $36 million in 1954, while employment gradually increased from 25,000 up to 71,000. By the end of 1953, Douglas had a record backlog of just over $2 billion worth of aircraft on order, and it would spend the rest of the decade in a very strong financial position. But not everything was as rosy as the numbers would make you think, and the 1950s would mark the beginning of a quiet, gradual series of events, some highly obscure, some glaringly obvious in hindsight, which individually did not always amount to much, but collectively would seal the company's fate just a decade later. Now, the downfall of the Douglas Company is a relatively complex topic, but broadly speaking, it boils down to three key things. Firstly, there is Douglas's reluctance to initiate the development of a jet-powered airliner, and this allowed his competition to get ahead, and the company was forever playing a game of catch-up. Secondly, the company's luck ran out when it came to securing large military contracts, which left it financially vulnerable to potential cost blowouts from its commercial designs. And thirdly, the company's structure and its culture became disjointed, particularly after Douglas Jr. took the helm in 1957, and this led to poor interdepartmental communication, which ultimately led to financial chaos. All of these things more or less happened simultaneously as well, which really didn't help things, but now, in this video, we're going to look at them in order of topic rather than chronology, so that I'm not bouncing between three different points of discussion every minute or so, which would probably make this video far too chaotic to follow. So, we'll start with the airliner problem, as that was technically the first of the three to really arise. And this begins with the Douglas DC-7. This would be the last piston-powered airliner that the company would produce, and in fact, it was one that Douglas himself didn't really want to produce either. By the early 1950s, he had already given thought to the idea of a jet-powered airliner, but he wasn't yet ready to commit. Although the US military had rapidly transitioned into the jet age, Douglas believed that the commercial market would take much longer. He believed that jet technology was still too expensive to allow airliners to be competitively profitable, and he believed that the industry in general needed to conduct more research to make sure that jet airliners were safe. They would, after all, fly higher and faster than anything before, requiring more advanced pressurized cabins, avionics, fuel systems, etc., and all of this added many, many more potential points of failure. Because of this, Douglas hesitated to begin development work on a jetliner, despite learning of the development of the de Havilland Comet, and the company only conducted quiet, low-level research. For his part, he was more than happy to continue sale of the DC-6, which was proving to be exceedingly popular. But at the same time, several airlines, particularly American Airlines, were insisting upon an improved follow-up. They wanted something that could do a non-stop transcontinental flight between New York and LA in under 8 hours, and that was something that the DC-6 simply couldn't do. Though he initially resisted them, the heads of American Airlines and Pan American eventually convinced Douglas to produce one last piston airliner. Now, Douglas was resistant to this, mostly because it would force him to use the Wright R3350 duplex Cyclone, which was the only engine that was powerful enough and available in quantity. This was the same engine that powered their successful AD-1, but it had brought the company considerable headaches. This was in fact nothing new. This same engine had also powered the B-29 Superfortress, and it too suffered from a litany of engine problems. A lot of this stemmed from the fact that they frequently overheated, a result of putting a lot of power into a relatively small and complex package. But American Airlines were insistent, and Douglas eventually formalized production of the DC-7 after receiving a contract of sale for 25 to be sold to them as soon as it was ready. The prototype DC-7 first flew in May of 1953, and it entered service with American Airlines in November of the same year. Later on, it was joined by the DC-7B, which was a longer-range version designed for Pan American that could carry up to 100 passengers, but the company struggled to find buyers overseas. This changed with the DC-7C. This was also designed for Pan Am, who now wanted an airliner that was capable of making non-stop transatlantic flights to Europe. This model had more powerful engines, and an extended wingspan to allow for larger internal fuel tanks. It began flying in 1956, and it became the first airliner that was capable of reliably completing transatlantic flights, both to and from Europe, as prevailing winds had always made the westbound flight far more challenging. Its ability to make the Atlantic crossing reliably soon resulted in export orders flowing in from the various European carriers, with KLM being the biggest customer immediately ordering 15. Though it was proving to be a successful design, and in many ways it was viewed as the pinnacle of the piston-powered airliner, only 338 DC-7s were built, compared to just over 700 of the preceding DC-6. As Douglas had feared, the Wright duplex Cyclone proved to remain a highly recalcitrant engine, and numerous mid-flight engine failures hurt its reputation. Some airliners retired the DC-7 after just 5 years of service, whilst retaining their older DC-6s for considerably longer. Additionally, for Douglas, the DC-7 was considerably more expensive to produce, and this, combined with all the engine problems, meant that the type was a net loss for the company in general. In fact, Harry Strangman, who was the company's vice president of finance at the time, had remarked that if it wasn't for the military aircraft being built by the El Segundo division, the company could have well faced bankruptcy due to the DC-7's costly development. But cost was not the only thing that curtailed the production of the DC-7. The bigger factor at play was the true emergence of the jet airliner. Though the Comet was already in service on the other side of the Atlantic, Donald Douglas and his chief engineer Arthur Raymond were still hesitant to fully commit to an all-jet commercial transport. Although the company now had significant experience in developing jet-powered aircraft, Douglas knew that the airline industry as a whole currently operated $1.5 billion worth of piston-powered aircraft, and he doubted it could stomach the financial burden of a rapid transition. And in his defense, this was an opinion that many airliners shared. Instead, Douglas found himself in favor of meeting in the middle, and he allowed the company to begin several design studies for a turboprop airliner instead, one of which being a heavily modified DC-7. However, in secrecy, he also initiated a secret project in June of 1952 to work on designing a pure jet-powered airliner just in case, though he still found it doubtful that they should fully commit to the idea until several more years had passed. The fatal accidents involving the de Havilland Comets in 1954, which led to the type's grounding pending investigations, seemed to confirm Douglas in his reservations, but now an old rival had come back to haunt him. The Boeing company, though well known for its production of bombers during the Second World War, had been thoroughly beaten and embarrassed in the competition to develop commercial piston-powered airliners. This had always been a bit of a sensitive subject for Bill Allen, the president of Boeing since 1945, and who had worked for the company since 1930. Boeing had gained experience in producing large jet aircraft, with the Boeing B-47 Stratojet and the B-52 Stratofortress. And with the piston engine market so thoroughly dominated by both Douglas and Lockheed, Bill Allen knew that his company had but one choice. It had to take its experience in building large jet bombers and gamble everything on building the world's first successful jet airliner. The result was that Douglas, and many an airline executive for that matter, was considerably shocked when Boeing unveiled its Model 367-80 in July of 1954. Douglas was shocked because he was expecting Boeing to unveil a new prototype fuel tanker, something that his company was also developing as part of a competition for the Air Force. He had not expected Boeing to take a $16 million gamble, one which would break Boeing if it backfired, to jointly develop a brand new jet airliner as well. But they had, and both the Air Force and the airline industry suddenly really liked what they saw. The immediate interest in what would become known as the Boeing 707 forced Douglas to fully commit his company into the jet airline market, lest they lose their relevance and dominance in this field. This led to the rapid development of the Douglas DC-8, which would become the company's biggest financial investment. The need for the DC-8 to be successful was then further highlighted when Douglas lost out on an opportunity to produce a fuel tanker for the Air Force. This was a particularly bitter blow, as it had been expected that the Air Force would split contracts between both Boeing and Douglas, as the Air Force was calling for several hundred of these tankers to be built over a relatively short time. But the work was given to Boeing exclusively, and this allowed Boeing to absorb much of the 707's development costs with lucrative military contracts. After round-the-clock development work, Douglas announced the DC-8 program publicly in June of 1955. Though Boeing now had a considerable head start, and Douglas expected the 707 to enter service a full year before the DC-8, there were some advantages to coming second in this particular race. As the DC-8 was still in many ways a paper aeroplane, merely existing on the drawing board, it gave the Douglas sales team an opportunity to go out and speak with various airliners and find out what they specifically wanted in a jetliner of the future. It also gave them an opportunity to ask the airliners what they liked and didn't like from the competing design that was being advertised by Boeing. Though many airlines gave conflicting answers, some of which could never be entertained, one big result was that the DC-8 would be designed to have 6 abreast seating, in 2 rows of 3, and this gave it an advantage over the 5 abreast seating arrangement of the Boeing 707, which had a row of 3 and a row of 2. Douglas was also able to use larger and more fuel-efficient engines, which had not been ready for Boeing at the time, and this made the DC-8 a very attractive alternative, even though it wouldn't get on the scene first. The result was that in October of 1955, United Airlines, who had been tipped to go for the Boeing 707, instead placed an order for 30 DC-8s at a cost of $175 million. Not long after this, Boeing made a last-minute and costly decision to redesign the 707, increasing its wing and fuselage to match the DC-8's capabilities, and the ridiculously and expensive competition between the big airliners was well and truly on. The DC-8 program was as much of a gamble for Douglas as the 707 was for Boeing. It cost twice as much to develop and produce when compared to the DC-7, but it was expected to produce triple the revenue in commercial operations. This was in part thanks to a much lower operating cost per mile thanks to the jet's higher speed, and because of this, the DC-8 was predicted to be almost 25% cheaper to operate than the DC-6. By the time the first DC-8 was ready for its maiden flight, the first 707s, as predicted, were about to enter service, but the race between Douglas and Boeing was still neck and neck. Orders for both companies were beginning to pile up. Although most airliners were reluctant to invest heavily into jets, as they were considerably more expensive, they also knew that if their competitors did it first, they would be doomed. And so, even though most of the airline industry wasn't quite ready to go to jets yet, most of them were essentially forced to do it anyway. And so, once again, the demand for a new, expensive, and quite experimental airliner once again exceeded Donald Douglas's expectations. He watched the DC-8 make its maiden flight from Long Beach on May 30th, 1958. It was a significant year for the company. It officially signalled its entry into the world of the jet airliner, and it was also the first full year where Donald Douglas wouldn't manage the day-to-day running of operations. That task now fell to his son. In 1957, Donald Douglas Jr. was made president of the Douglas Aircraft Company. He'd been with the company since 1939, gradually moving up through the ranks. His earliest work was on the development of the C-54 transport. Then he'd worked on various experimental projects, eventually being responsible for test flight operations, and he became the director of the company's research labs and testing division in 1949. 2 years later, he was elected as vice president of the company, and in 1953 he became a member of its board of directors. In many ways, Douglas Jr. was like his father. He was a hard-driven young man who was passionate about his work, and, like his father, he had developed a love for the sea. In 1932, he had earned a silver medal at the Summer Olympic Games in the 6-meter yacht class, and in later years he owned a successive series of fine sailing craft. But, in many other ways, the two men couldn't be more different. Senior was quieter and more reserved. Junior was more extroverted and sociable. Senior had patience, perhaps too much patience at times, and his son was the opposite, passionate and sometimes quick-tempered. The DC-8 project was a prime example of their differences. Don Jr. had pushed for the development of a jetliner as soon as it was feasible, believing that speed would be the deciding factor in the commercial market of the 50s and 60s. But old Douglas felt that it was too risky, and he'd adopted a more conservative and incremental approach, with the appearance of the Boeing jetliner forcing his hand. This conflict over the future of the airliner resulted in many arguments behind closed doors, but despite their differences, the two men would ultimately support each other. Don Jr. put his full effort into the development and testing of the DC-7, despite thinking it a waste of time, and Douglas Sr. did not impede the various design studies that were initiated in the 40s and early 50s to explore the possibility of jet-powered commercial transports. Their unity was not merely from a common desire to see their companies succeed, despite their diverging visions on what that success would entail, but because they had recently found some common ground, besides a love of sailing. Though the two had nearly disowned each other over Don Jr.'s marriage before the war, they had now been united by divorce. Don Jr. and his wife had split not long after the war, and after a long estrangement, Donald Douglas and his wife Charlotte went through a hotly contested and painfully public divorce in 1953. Like many divorces, it essentially split the Douglas family down the middle, with the 5 children essentially being forced to take sides. But Donald Douglas Sr. was very surprised to see his hot-headed son joining him. Don Jr.'s steadfast and unwavering support of his father during the long, drawn-out proceedings did much to repair their relationship, and despite their creative and personal differences, Douglas would be equally supportive of his son when he handed the reins of the company over to him in 1957. But when Don Jr. did take over in 1957, he was inheriting something of a poisoned chalice, though he did not yet know it. His father's reluctance to transition into the jet age was not a fatal mistake by itself, but events would now unfold that would seal the company's fate. When Douglas and Boeing were racing to develop their commercial jets between 1954 and 1958, the airline market had been experiencing a period of massive growth. Passenger mileage was increasing by about 15% on average each year, between 1953 and 1957 inclusive, and the economy was growing just as quickly. But when the DC-8 and 707 were beginning to enter service, between 1958 and 1959, the situation had changed dramatically. Airline demand had slumped, and as the 1960 recession began, neither the 707 or the DC-8 had been sold in the numbers expected. This was further compounded by the fact that both aircraft had failed to meet range and fuel efficiency guarantees, which required costly modifications, and this resulted in a further drop in sales. Usually, the year that an airliner entered service, it would coincide with a boost in sales, but when the DC-8 entered service in 1959, only 18 aircraft were sold that year, despite well over 100 being on order. This was bad enough on its own, and it mirrored the problems of the DC-7, whose own development cost exceeded its sale value. But the losses of the DC-7 had been offset by the huge orders for military aircraft that were being built by the El Segundo Division. Now, things had changed, because El Segundo was rapidly running out of work. In 1952, the company had received a contract to produce what would become the venerable A-4 Skyhawk. But little did the division know that this would be the last big military contract it would ever receive from the US Navy. Existing contracts for the F-3D, AD-1, F-4D, and A-3D were completed respectively in 1953, 57, 58, and 61, and then nothing else really followed. There had been hopes that the promising F-5D-1 Skylancer would get a big contract, but it didn't. To make matters worse, El Segundo was also now without its chief engineer. Ed Heinemann, who had been responsible for the company's most successful military design since the late 1930s, had resigned in 1960. He and Donald Douglas Jr. did not get on very well at all, and when Douglas began restructuring the company, he made Heinemann vice president of the company's European division. It was a role that Heinemann neither wanted or was suitable for, and after a brief stint in this role, he left the company for good. The absence of his leadership and strong drive for quality control would soon be keenly felt. That being said, even if Ed Heinemann hadn't been essentially forced out of the company, he wouldn't have had his position for very much longer. Due to the dwindling number of military aircraft on order, El Segundo became unprofitable, and the plant was actually closed in 1962, with production of the Skyhawk being transferred to the Long Beach facility. The problems stemming from the loss of El Segundo was twofold. Not only did Douglas lose many skilled engineers, who couldn't relocate to other facilities, but it had huge financial ramifications. The drop in revenue from military contracts meant that the Douglas Aircraft Company couldn't easily absorb all of the costs incurred by the DC-8 program, of which it had invested $500 million in development thus far, and as a result, the company posted a loss of $33 million for the 1959 fiscal year. It posted another loss of $19 million in 1960, and although it did once again return to profits in 1961, the company couldn't afford to develop any other commercial airliners to complement the DC-8, whereas Boeing was already working on the Model 720. To get around this problem, the company went into business with Sud Aviation, who gave them the sales rights and product support responsibilities for their Caravelle twin-engine transport. Douglas also obtained a license to manufacture the aircraft in the United States, should they secure enough sales to justify the initial outlay. But once again, Boeing beat them to the punch. Douglas did secure some sales to both United Airlines and TWA, but the sales of the new Boeing 727 quickly caught up and then overtook them. Douglas quickly abandoned the idea of selling the Caravelle in the United States, and it soon terminated its other agreements with Sud Aviation as well, viewing them as a waste of money. Now, while Douglas was competing with Boeing for the long-haul market, and while it was failing in the medium-haul market, it did not neglect the potential for a shorter-range design. Indeed, both Don Jr. and Sr. believed that the short-haul and executive market promised to be exceedingly popular in the jet age, particularly if they could sell planes to European customers. With this in mind, several design studies had been initiated in the late 50s and early 60s to explore the idea of a short-range twin-engine transport, and in 1962, the economy, and thus the company's fortunes, had recovered enough for Douglas to start detailed design work on a new short-haul airliner, and this became known as the DC-9. Up until this point, Donald Douglas had always missed the mark in predicting the popularity of his commercial aircraft, but for the first time, his predictions about the popularity of this aircraft would be correct. He expected that the DC-9 would be popular. In fact, it was very popular, possibly too popular. In April of 1963, the company formally announced the development and production of the DC-9, and in less than a month it already made its first sales to Delta Airlines. The company had originally planned to produce approximately 500 DC-9s over a 10-year period, but the type proved to be so appealing to customers that they already had 400 on order within the first 3 years, and eventually just under 1,000 DC-9s would eventually be produced. The DC-9 was produced using a new risk-sharing program, with various parts being built in the United States, Canada, and Italy. Final assembly was done at the Long Beach plant, and here the company now had a massive assembly line, where on one side it produced the DC-8, and on the other side it produced the DC-9. Additionally, the increasing popularity of the DC-9, and thus the increasing sales, allowed the company to finally invest in planned improvements for the DC-8, which had begun to lag behind the Boeing 707 in sales, as a result of the 707 being offered in a variety of different shapes and sizes that Douglas at the time could not afford to match. The result was the so-called Super 60s. There was the DC-8-61, -62, and -63. The 61 and 63 models offered substantially increased payload capacity, and the 62 had a much longer range. Their popularity quickly grew, with the Super 60s eventually becoming the dominant model of the DC-8. And this, combined with the sudden popularity of the DC-9, meant that Douglas once again had to rapidly expand its production facilities in 1966. And this is where things start to go very wrong very quickly. In 1966, the Douglas Aircraft Company completely lost control of its costs, and in less than a year it would be facing bankruptcy. And this was a perfect storm of contributing factors. Firstly, Douglas had recently lost out on a competition to build a large strategic transport, with Lockheed being awarded a contract to produce the C-5 Galaxy. This all but locked out Douglas from the hugely lucrative market for producing transports for the US military for at least the next 2 decades, and it was now using this aborted project as part of a design study into a new wide-body airliner. This was initially to be a double-decker design, intended to compete with Boeing's 747, which was now in development. And although this would never fully eventuate, instead evolving into the DC-10, it took vital engineers away from the projects to improve the DC-8 and build the DC-9. This meant that the people managing these existing projects had even more work to do, and they were already under a considerable amount of pressure, as a lot of them were quite new to the job. Which leads us to the second problem. Between 1958 and 1956, the company had lost a lot of its most experienced managers, across almost all areas as well. Research, development, manufacturing, sales, you name it, there had been a serious changing of the guard. Many of their replacements were still adjusting to their new positions, or were sometimes better suited elsewhere, and this made the company very top-heavy, with poor communication between departments. One big consequence of this was that the Douglas sales team was signing up airliners left, right, and centre without fully appreciating that the production facilities had no way of keeping pace with the rapidly expanding demand. This meant that the company had to very quickly organise new production facilities, build new tools, and hire and train more workers. And this all cost a lot of money, and it also led into the next big problem: sourcing said manpower in the first place. As orders for the DC-8 had declined during the 1960 recession, and as the supply of military contracts all but dried up, the Douglas workforce had shrunk down from 27,000 to just 7,500. Now, all of a sudden, the demand was back, and that meant that the workforce had to rapidly expand. Now, on its own, this was a big problem as it was, as Douglas had to rapidly hire and then train thousands of workers to produce its aircraft. In many ways, it was similar to a situation that the company faced at the start of its involvement in the Second World War, but at the same time it was vastly different from the days of the Second World War because the aircraft being built back then were much more simpler. Unlike before, the company didn't just need people who could operate a simple rivet gun, they needed skilled workers to produce the complex electrical systems, install the advanced turbojet engines, build and test the pressurized cabins, the list goes on. And all of this was now further exacerbated by the escalating situation of the Vietnam War. Not only was Douglas struggling to hire new employees because everyone was getting drafted up, but they were losing many existing qualified employees who were also being drafted up. And then, whilst Douglas was scrambling to A. hire new employees, and B. not lose existing ones, the Vietnam War caused an explosion of military contracts. The loss of Ed Heinemann and the El Segundo Division was particularly felt, as orders for the A-4 Skyhawk suddenly increased by an order of magnitude, and the company scrambled to build them in quantity, on time, and most importantly, within cost. The result of all of this was simple. Although the company had a backlog that was now worth $3 billion, it suddenly posted a net loss of $3 million in the first quarter of 1966. By the end of the year, this had blown out to a loss of $27 million, but the situation had become so chaotic that some estimated that the true loss could be closer to $80 million. Because of all of the aforementioned problems, Douglas was now making huge losses on every single aircraft it was building. Everything had suddenly become too expensive. Now, much of this came as a complete shock to both Douglas Sr. and his son, who had announced at the start of the year that the company was, in fact, in the best financial position it had found itself in years, not staring down the barrel of a financial apocalypse. Unfortunately, the communication structure of the company had become so disjointed that they simply weren't aware of many of the problems that had been bubbling under the surface for the past few years. As things rapidly spiraled out of control, Donald Douglas once again took over control of his company, but he was particularly aggrieved to see the board of directors, and many of the senior-level managers, suddenly turn on his son and blame him solely for the company's problems. Rapidly running out of options, Douglas approached the Wall Street firm of Lazard Frères to help him find a way out of their impending financial collapse. The management firm set up shop in Santa Monica, and after a thorough examination of the situation, some of which yielded some truly horrifying figures, they presented Douglas with the ugly truth. His company needed new management, and more importantly, it needed a lot more money, and this meant they had no choice but to seek a merger. During the next few weeks, Douglas received offers for a merger from Fairchild, General Dynamics, Martin, McDonnell, North America, and Signal Oil and Gas. The offer from McDonnell surprised him. A few years earlier, James McDonnell, who at the time already owned a few $100,000 of Douglas's shares, had made the offer of a merger. At the time, Douglas had been quite offended and had flatly refused, and McDonnell had angrily sold his stock for a handsome profit, for at the time Douglas was doing quite well. Now he was back, and his offer eventually turned out to be the best. The offer by McDonnell was unanimously approved on the 13th of January 1967, and government approval swiftly followed, owing to the increasing demand for Douglas aircraft in the Vietnam War. Everything was formalized by the spring, and on the 28th of April 1967, the Douglas Aircraft Company officially ceased to exist, and the era of the new McDonnell Douglas Company officially began. Donald Douglas Sr. was made an honorary chairman of the board, and Douglas Jr. was brought on as one of its directors, working with them until 1989. The story of the McDonnell Douglas Corporation is one for another day, but I do want to touch on one facet of Douglas's downfall that is often a cause of contention. At the time of the company's collapse, Douglas Jr. bore the brunt of the blame for its failure, but much of the criticism that was directed towards him was emotional, biased, and often untrue, something that his father deeply regretted. Donald Douglas had managed his company with a firm hand, forming a tight-knit network of individuals across all levels of the company, but in a way he had done his job too well. He had surrounded himself with people that he worked with very well, and who were very loyal to him, but that was it. They were loyal to him. Because of this loyalty, many of the company's old guard viewed his son as just that, a young, impulsive man who could never fit in his father's shoes, despite the fact that he had climbed the company's ranks on his own, with Douglas specifically going out of his own way to avoid any hint of favoritism. Unfortunately, it did not help that the two Douglases were very different in personality, and this led to an inevitable rift in the ranks of the company when his son took over the presidency. People who were used to working with the father did not necessarily find it easy to work with the son. The animosity that grew between the younger Douglas and his father's old cohort led to inevitable failings. Almost all of them were either replaced or simply resigned from personal feeling, and in the end both sides were equally to blame, though Douglas Jr. often received the most of it as the company was his father's namesake. But this alone had not doomed the company, as some people like to say. There were many causes, not least being his father's decision to delay entry into the jet age and giving Boeing a head start. Additionally, even if Douglas Jr. had not taken over in his father's place, it's highly likely that any successor to Douglas himself would have faced some level of resistance once they'd taken charge. The McDonnell-Douglas Corporation would continue to produce many of Douglas's designs for many years. They also carried on the use of Douglas's iconic logo, which went back to the flight of the world cruisers way back in 1924. It was a logo that Boeing would later inherit when they merged with McDonnell Douglas in 1997. If Douglas ever felt any bitterness about the loss of his company, he never voiced it publicly, and he bowed out with pride and dignity, saying that one should never grow old where one was once great. He often reflected warmly about his company's achievements over the past 40 years, and he spent his retirement sailing his yacht and writing poetry. Donald Douglas passed away aged 88 on February 1st, 1981. At his request, his ashes were scattered over the Pacific Ocean, where he had spent some of the happiest days of his life. Today, many of his aircraft are still flying, and many take pride of place as iconic displays in aviation museums around the world. They continue the legacy of Douglas and his aircraft, and it is a legacy that, as of now, has carried on for just over a century. As always, thank you all so much for watching, and a big thank you, of course, to the Patreon supporters. And I hope everyone enjoyed this final installment of what has been a bit of a marathon for me to do. Again, I apologise that the parts 1, part 2, and part 3 have been so spread out, but life, health issues, and, buying a house kind of got in the way of things. But I am planning to do some other longer videos in the near future, so stay tuned for more longish content. A big thank you, of course, to our Wing Commander tier patrons, our highest tier supporters. And I'm currently working on the special video that the Patreon supporters recently voted on, so expect to see that at some point in early to mid-October. But, as always, thank you all so much for your continued support, and I will catch you all next time. Goodbye.